The fluorescent lights flickered in the makeshift briefing room, casting harsh shadows across weathered faces. Young soldiers clustered together, their laughter echoing as they mocked the new recruit sitting alone in the corner. Her small hands worked methodically over an M24 sniper rifle, cleaning each component with practiced precision. The movements were too familiar, too confident for someone who supposedly just arrived. The colonel stormed in, ready to bark orders. But when his eyes caught sight of how she handled each screw, each barrel groove, his voice died in his throat. "Where did you get that rifle?" The words came out as barely a whisper. The entire room fell silent. That weapon wasn't something ordinary soldiers were permitted to touch. Sarah Martinez had arrived at Forward Operating Base Delta 3 days ago, transferred from what the paperwork vaguely described as logistical support. At barely 5'4", she looked like she'd blow away in a strong desert wind. The other soldiers had sized her up immediately. She didn't fit the mold of what they expected from someone being sent to one of the most dangerous outposts in the theater. "Look at Tiny over there," Private Johnson whispered to his buddy, nodding towards Sarah as she claimed the corner bunk. "She can't even carry full gear without falling over." Corporal Williams was even less charitable. "Maybe she's here for paperwork, not the front lines. Probably types faster than she can run." The jokes never stopped. During mess hall conversations, equipment checks the long hours of downtime. Sarah absorbed it all without reaction, her face a mask of professional neutrality that somehow made the mockery sting less and irritate her tormentors more. But there were details that sharp eyes might have noticed, if anyone had bothered to look closely. The way she instinctively checked sight lines when entering rooms, how her gaze automatically swept for elevated positions and potential cover. The faint callus on her right index finger, exactly where it would rest against a trigger guard during extended use. Most telling was the old scar running across the back of her left hand. Not a kitchen accident or childhood mishap, but the precise mark left by hot brass casings ejecting repeatedly in the same spot. Tonight, while others played cards and swapped stories, Sarah sat alone at the far table, breaking down and cleaning an M24 sniper weapon system with methodical care. Each component came apart in her hands like she'd done this 10,000 times before. The bolt assembly trigger mechanism, scope mounts. Everything handled with an intimacy that spoke of muscle memory built over years. She cleaned the barrel with long, smooth strokes, checking the rifling with a small mirror, testing the action with the satisfied nod of someone who knew exactly how it should feel. Her fingers traced the stock's cheek rest, adjusting it by fractions of millimeters. What's she doing with that rifle?" someone whispered. "Probably pretending she knows how to use it," came the snickered reply. Sarah's hands never paused, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd heard worse. Done her time being underestimated by people who thought warfare was about size and swagger rather than patience and precision. The M24 in her hands was no ordinary weapon. While standard issue rifles bore serial numbers in neat military progression, this one carried markings that told a different story. Custom modifications not available through normal channels. A scope that cost more than most soldiers made in 3 months. Grip tape worn smooth in patterns that matched her hands perfectly. Most soldiers, if they were lucky and skilled, might qualify to touch such a weapon under supervision. Fewer still would ever be trusted to carry one in combat. None would clean it alone in the corner of a mess hall like they owned it. The colonel chose that moment to make his evening rounds, boots clicking against concrete as he surveyed his domain. He was accustomed to having answers, to understanding exactly what belonged in his command and why. His gaze swept the room and stopped cold when it reached Sarah's table. Not because of her presence, but because of what lay disassembled in front of her. Every piece of the M24 system was laid out with surgical precision, each component exactly where it should be for optimal cleaning. But more than that, the serial numbers, custom workwear patterns, everything told him this wasn't just any rifle. This was a ghost weapon, one that shouldn't exist in his inventory. "Soldier," his voice cut through the conversation like a blade. "Where did you get that rifle?" The radio crackled to life before Sarah could answer, emergency frequencies cutting through the tension like shattered glass. "Delta Base, this is Recon Team Charlie. We are pinned down on Hill 847. Repeat, we are pinned down and taking heavy fire from multiple positions." Lieutenant Morrison grabbed the handset, his knuckles white. Charlie team, this is Delta Base. What's your status? Static, gunfire. Then Sergeant Kelly's voice strained but professional. We've got enemy fighters in elevated positions, approximately 400 meters north. They have clear sight lines on our only extraction route. We cannot move without taking casualties. The briefing room erupted into controlled chaos. Maps spread across tables, fingers tracing topographical lines, calculating distances and angles. Everyone knew what pin down meant in this terrain. Recon Team Charlie was trapped. How long until we can get birds in the air? The colonel demanded. Air support is committed to another operation, sir. Earliest availability is 40 minutes. 40 minutes might as well have been 40 hours. Everyone present had seen what happened to isolated units left exposed in these hills. What about ground reinforcements? Nearest unit is Bravo Company 30 clicks out on foot. Even if they moved immediately, the unfinished sentence hung in the air. Too far. Too long. Too late. Private Johnson, who'd mocked Sarah's size hours earlier, was pacing near the radio. We're going to lose them, he said, his voice cracking. We're actually going to lose them. The radio crackled again. Delta Base, we have visual on enemy movement. They're trying to flank our position. We need immediate support or we'll be overrun. Sarah had been listening from her corner, the M24, still partially disassembled. Now she stood, her movements fluid and deliberate. What's the distance to Hill 847? She asked quietly. Lieutenant Morrison barely glanced at her. 850 meters, but that's not, wind conditions. Look, soldier, this isn't the time for wind conditions. She repeated, her voice carrying an authority that made Morrison stop mid-sentence. Southwest, 5 to 8 knots. But listen, we need real solutions here, not. Sarah was already reassembling the M24, her hands moving with mechanical precision. Bolt assembly slid home with a satisfying click. Scope mounted and torqued to specification. Magazine seated with the firm snap of metal on metal. I can make the shot, she said simply. The room went dead silent except for the distant sound of automatic weapons fire through the radio. Then Private Johnson laughed. Not happy, but bitter. You with that rifle, you can barely lift the thing. Corporal Williams joined in. 850 meters in this wind. Even our best marksmen would struggle? Delta Base, we need help now. Kelly's voice erupted from the radio, more urgent. They're moving on our position. Sarah slung the M24 across her shoulder and headed for the door. The weight settled against her back like it belonged there. Where do you think you're going? The colonel called. She paused at the threshold, looking back at the room full of soldiers who'd written her off. To save your men, sir. The observation tower was a 30-foot climb up rusted ladder rungs. Sarah scaled it without hesitation, the M24 secure against her back, her breathing steady despite the exertion. At the top, she had a clear view across the valley to Hill 847. Through her scope, she could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions. At least 3 separate firing points arranged to create a perfect killing field. The wind was stronger up here, gusting unpredictably through the tower's metal framework. 850 meters was at the absolute edge of effective range for the M24, and that was under perfect conditions. These were far from perfect conditions. She settled into prone position, feeling the familiar weight of the rifle stock against her shoulder, the scope's eye relief perfectly positioned. Her breathing slowed, became controlled mechanical. Through the crosshairs, she could see an enemy fighter moving between positions. The rangefinder confirmed 847 meters. Wind indicator showed crosswind of approximately 6 knots, gusting to 10. Delta Base, they're flanking us. Kelly's voice crackled over her radio. 30 seconds and we'll be completely exposed. Sarah's world narrowed to the small circle of magnified reality through her scope. The enemy fighter had stopped, was taking aim at something she couldn't see. One of Kelly's men, most likely. Time compressed. Her finger found the trigger, took up the slack. The crosshairs settled center mass on the target. She breathed out halfway and held it. The shot had to be perfect. The M24 bucked against Sarah's shoulder with familiar violence. The report echoed across the valley like thunder, sharp and final. Through the scope, she watched the enemy fighter spin and drop his weapon, clattering against rocks. But there was no time to admire the shot. 2 more hostiles were already adjusting their positions. Holy shit! Someone breathed over the radio. Where did that come from? Down in the briefing room, every soldier pressed against windows trying to see what was happening. The colonel had his binoculars trained on the observation tower, watching in disbelief as the small figure at the top worked the bolt action and acquired a new target. Sarah's second shot came 18 seconds after the first. Another crack that split the desert air. Another body that went limp among the rocks of Hill 847. Delta Base, this is Charlie Team. Kelly's voice came through clearly now, no longer strained with desperation. Unknown sniper has neutralized 2 enemy positions. We have a clear route to extraction. Moving now. In the tower, Sarah continued tracking movement through her scope. She could see the remaining enemy fighters breaking contact, abandoning their positions, as they realized they were being hunted by someone they couldn't see, couldn't locate, couldn't fight back against. She squeezed off a third shot, not at a person, but at equipment. A radio or communication device exploded in sparks and plastic fragments. By the time she climbed down recon team, Charlie was already moving to safety. No casualties, no losses, mission accomplished. The briefing room was completely silent when she walked back in. Every eye was on her, but the laughter and mockery had vanished completely. In its place was something harder to define. Respect mixed with confusion, admiration tempered by disbelief. Sarah returned to her corner table and began field stripping the M24 again, checking each component for signs of stress or fouling. Her movements were methodical, professional, completely routine, as if she hadn't just pulled off 3 precision shots at maximum range in difficult conditions, as if she hadn't just saved 4 lives. The colonel approached slowly, his binoculars still hanging around his neck. When he spoke, his voice carried weight that hadn't been there before. "Those serial numbers on that rifle," he said quietly, "they match a weapon reported missing 3 years ago, from a classified unit that officially doesn't exist." Sarah didn't look up from her cleaning, but her hands paused for just a moment. "The Ghost Company," the colonel continued, "Delta Force Sniper Unit, disbanded after a mission went sideways in Syria. Most personnel were KIA or listed as MIA. Now her hands stopped completely. There was one survivor, a sergeant who extracted under her own power after her entire team was wiped out. Carried 3 wounded men 15 kilometers to safety before collapsing from blood loss and exhaustion. Sarah finally looked up, meeting the colonel's gaze directly for the first time since arriving at the base. That sergeant was awarded the Silver Star Bronze Star with V device and a Purple Heart. She was also offered promotion to warrant officer in her choice of assignments. The room was so quiet that the desert wind outside sounded like a hurricane. Instead, she requested immediate discharge and disappeared into the civilian world. Took her personal weapons with her, including a customized M24 that had been specially modified for her specific requirements. Sarah resumed cleaning the rifle, but everyone could see the slight tremor in her hands now. The sergeant's name was Sarah Martinez, age 26. Born in El Paso, Texas, grew up shooting rabbits in the desert with her grandfather's M22. Private Johnson, who had been so quick with jokes hours before, was staring at Sarah like he was seeing a ghost, which in a way he was. She held the record for longest confirmed kill in her unit, 1,247 meters, single shot, moving target, 15-knot crosswind. Sarah set down the cleaning rod and looked around the room. Every face showed the same expression. Gradual understanding of who they'd been sharing meals with, sleeping in the same quarters, with dismissing as just another support soldier. "I didn't come back to fight," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came back because I couldn't stand the nightmares anymore. Couldn't stand living with what happened to my team." The colonel sat down across from her, his expression gentle rather than commanding. "And yet you just risked your life to save men you barely know." Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Once a sniper, always a sniper, I guess. You can take the soldier out of the war, but you can't take the war out of the soldier." She finished reassembling the M24, each piece sliding into place with satisfying precision. When she was done, she held the weapon across her lap. "This rifle has 37 confirmed kills," she said quietly. "Every single one kept me awake at night for 3 years. But today those shots felt different." "How so?" "Today I saved lives instead of taking them." "Sakitana," the radio crackled one more time. "Delta Base, this is Charlie Team. We're at the extraction point and ready for pickup. Tell whoever made those shots that Sergeant Kelly says thanks. Those boys are going home to their families tonight because of whoever was on that rifle. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself smile. Really smile. For the first time in longer than she could remember. The transformation in the room was immediate and total. Where minutes before there had been casual dismissal and mockery, now there was the profound silence of people recalibrating everything they thought they knew. Private Johnson, who had been most vocal in his skepticism, was staring at the floor. When he finally looked up, his face was flushed with shame. "Ma'am, we..." He struggled with words that seemed inadequate. "We had no idea." Sarah's response was measured professional. "You weren't supposed to have any idea. That was the point." Corporal Williams, who had suggested she was better suited for paperwork, approached hesitantly. "Sergeant Martinez, I owe you an apology. We all do." "No," Sarah said, shaking her head. "You owe Recon Team Charlie gratitude. They're the ones who were willing to die for this mission. I just happened to be in position to prevent that." But the colonel understood what the others were still processing. "This wasn't luck or chance," he said, addressing the room. "Those shots required years of training, combat experience, and mental discipline that most soldiers never develop." He gestured toward the M24. "That weapon system is worth more than most of you make in a year. It's not standard issue. It's not available through normal supply channels. It's a custom precision instrument built specifically for one operator." Lieutenant Morrison, who had been quick to dismiss her questions during the crisis, stepped forward. "Sergeant, permission to ask, why did you leave after everything you accomplished?" The question hung in the air. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the familiar contours of the rifle stock. "Have you ever been the only survivor of something terrible, Lieutenant?" she asked finally. "The only one who walked away when everyone else didn't?" Morrison shook his head. "It changes you. Not just how you see combat, but how you see yourself. Every shot I took after Syria felt like I was trying to balance some cosmic scale. Like if I saved enough lives, maybe I could justify being the one who lived when better soldiers didn't." She set the rifle carefully on the table. "But it doesn't work that way. Survivor's guilt isn't mathematics. You can't solve it with confirmed kills or medals or anything else." Private Johnson found his voice again. "So why are you here now?" Sarah smiled, but it was a sad expression. "Because I finally realized that running away from who you are doesn't make the nightmares stop. It just makes them different." The colonel nodded slowly. "And now I know that this rifle doesn't have to be about taking lives. Today it was about preserving them. Maybe that's what I've been looking for." The room had filled with other personnel who had heard about the shooting. Mechanics, medics, communication specialists. Word traveled fast in a closed environment, and news of a precision shooting rescue traveled faster than most. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the senior NCO, pushed through the crowd. "Sergeant Martinez, is it true you made those shots from the observation tower?" "Yes, Master Sergeant," Rodriguez whistled low. 850 meters moving targets crosswind. That's not shooting, that's surgery. "It's training," Sarah corrected, "and muscle memory. And 3 years of trying to forget how to do something that apparently becomes part of your DNA." A young soldier near the back raised his hand tentatively. "Sergeant, could you maybe teach some of us about precision shooting?" Sarah looked around the room at faces that had gone from dismissive to respectful to hopeful in the span of an hour. These weren't the ghosts that haunted her nightmares or the fallen comrades she'd failed to save. These were living soldiers who wanted to learn to improve, to become better at the job they'd all volunteered for. "I'm not an instructor anymore," she said slowly. "I'm just support staff, remember." The colonel cleared his throat. "Actually, Sergeant, I think we need to discuss your duty assignment. Seems like there might be better ways to utilize your particular skill set." Shididi. For the first time since arriving at Forward Operating Base Delta, Sarah felt like she might actually belong somewhere again. 3 weeks passed before the full story of Hill 847 made its way through military channels, but when it did, it traveled with the velocity that only genuine heroism can generate. Sarah had requested that her role remain classified, but in a military environment where life and death often hinged on split-second decisions, word of exceptional marksmanship couldn't be contained. Stories had a way of growing in the telling. By the time the account reached other bases, Sarah had become the ghost of Delta Base, a mysterious sniper who could make impossible shots and then disappear back into the ranks. But Sarah herself resisted every attempt to capitalize on her renewed reputation. When the colonel offered transfer to a specialized sniper unit, she politely declined. When a reporter heard rumors and requested an interview, she made herself unavailable. "I didn't come back to be famous," she told the colonel during one of their weekly meetings. "I came back to find some kind of peace." Anna, the colonel, whose name was Thomas Bradley and who had served 3 tours himself, understood the distinction. "And have you found it?" Sarah considered the question while cleaning her rifle, a ritual she performed every evening, even when she hadn't fired it. "I'm starting to think peace isn't something you find. It's something you build one day at a time." The soldiers at Delta Base had adapted to her presence in ways that surprised everyone, including Sarah. The mockery had been replaced by quiet respect. Nobody asked for autographs or war stories, but they paid attention when she spoke during briefings. They listened when she offered technical advice about weapon maintenance or ballistics. More importantly, they trusted her. When Recon Team Delta needed overwatch support for a dangerous patrol, they specifically requested Sarah as their sniper coverage. When a suspicious vehicle was spotted at extreme visual range, Sarah was the one they called to make identification through her scope. She never fired another shot in anger during her remaining time at the base, but her presence changed how everyone else approached their duties. Standards for weapon maintenance improved. Marksmanship scores and routine qualifications went up across the board. Soldiers started asking more technical questions about ballistics and environmental factors. "You've become a teacher whether you wanted to or not," Lieutenant Morrison observed during a particularly intensive discussion about wind reading techniques. "I'm not teaching anything special," Sarah replied. "Just the same fundamentals everyone learns in basic training. But you're teaching them like they matter. Like precision and attention to detail can mean the difference between bringing everyone home and leaving people behind." That was the real legacy of Hill 847. Not the impossible shots or dramatic rescue, but the understanding that technical excellence could translate directly into preserved lives. Every soldier on the base had heard Sergeant Kelly's radio transmission. "Those boys are going home to their families tonight because of whoever was on that rifle." When Sarah's rotation was up 6 months later, the farewell ceremony was small and unofficial. She had requested no formal recognition, no speeches, no presentations, just a quiet handshake with the colonel and transport to the airfield. But the soldiers came anyway, not in formation or by order, but individually, quietly, to say goodbye to someone who had shown them that heroism didn't always look like what they expected. Private Johnson, who had grown into a competent marksman under Sarah's indirect mentorship, gave her a small wooden box. Inside was a spent 308 casing polished to mirror shine with an inscription, "Hill 847, Precision Saves Lives." "Keep it," Sarah said, closing the box and handing it back. "You'll understand someday that the real precision isn't in the shooting. It's in knowing when not to shoot." As her transport lifted off from Delta Base, Sarah looked down at the installation that had become unexpectedly something like home. The observation tower where she'd made those 3 shots was barely visible, just another piece of military architecture in endless desert landscape. But she knew that somewhere in the files and databases that track such things, Hill 847 would always be marked as a successful mission. 0 casualties. Objectives accomplished. Personnel recovered safely. In the end, that was the only recognition that mattered. Some stories end with explosions and fanfare, with medals pinned on chests and names carved into monuments. This story ends with a simple truth: the most dangerous people are often the quietest ones. In every organization, every team, every group working toward a common goal, there are individuals whose true capabilities remain hidden beneath unremarkable exteriors. They don't announce themselves with swagger or boast about their qualifications. They simply show up, do the work, and wait for the moment when their particular skills become necessary. Sarah Martinez understood something that many warriors never learn. Real strength doesn't need to prove itself until lives depend on it. Her M24 wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of precision, patience, and the kind of professional competence that can mean the difference between tragedy and triumph. The lesson of Hill 847 isn't about marksmanship or military tactics. It's about recognizing that heroism often wears the most ordinary faces, and that the person sitting quietly in the corner might be exactly the one you need when everything goes wrong. Never underestimate the quiet ones. They're usually quiet for very good reasons. Subscribe to HL Stories to never miss an untold story of courage, sacrifice, and the warriors who walk among us unrecognized. Hit that follow button and join a community that honors the real heroes, the ones who don't need recognition to do what's right.